couple little housekeeping things before we jump into some topics that we want to discuss. Just a reminder that this is really a discussion. It's a chance for us to talk about different issues in family law, topics that maybe some of you have submitted that you want to hear more about. But it's really not to be considered as legal advice. If you have specific questions for your situation or your circumstances, please reach out to a lawyer to get independent legal advice for your, facts. So just a quick hello to everybody. Give a brief background on all of our wonderful panelists today. So we have Joseph. He's an articling student at the firm, and he's set to be called to the bar in Ontario of June of this year. It's coming up fast. So
well, he's passed the bar. Does that make you a lawyer candidate now?
Lawyer candidate? Well, technically, both of you are still in your articling stage. So I think it's sort of a cross.
Steph throwing some shade down. Look out.
No. She's being articulate. That's important.
Not too quick. Not too quick.
She's being a lawyer.
Yeah. Being technical. Of course. So Joseph graduated from the Ted Rogers School of Management at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson. And he also obtained his law degree from Queen's University. And as he enters the next phase of his legal career, Joseph is committed to positively influencing the lives of those facing difficult family situations. We also have Shanza, another articling student or lawyer candidate, whatever you want to, whatever terminology you'd like to use. But Shanza is a recent law graduate from Osgoode Hall, and she is also set to be called to the bar in Ontario in June of this year. She's focused on launching her legal career in family law, and she's dedicated to providing empathetic and proficient legal support for those navigating family-related complexities. Her valuable expertise stems from active participation in legal clinics, mooting competitions, and her prior work as a legal assistant. And then we have Russell Alexander, the founder and senior partner at Russell Alexander Collaborative Family Lawyers. Russell has over 25 years of experience, and he uses his knowledge and expertise to serve his clients in all aspects of family law and to help them cope with the difficulties of separation and divorce. Russell has also written 4 books. He's an author, and he's a fully trained collaborative practice lawyer. He also speaks at conferences on, technology in the law, collaborative practice. You can, I'm sure he's got a long list of events coming up in the near future. Do you have one coming up soon?
Yeah, we've got, what have we got? We're doing an AI for a Pacific Legal Conference, which is kind of exciting. Yeah, just look for us online. You'll see us. We'll be promoting it somewhere.
Amazing. And
you're one of the senior lawyers on this panel.
At the firm, yeah, I've been
in this group. You're like a senior lawyer now.
It's true. That's very true. Look at me. Well, I have been at the firm since 2018, and so I was called to the bar in Ontario in 2022, and I'm now an associate lawyer at the firm. So I completed my undergraduate degree at Queen's University, and I obtained my law degree from the University of Liverpool in 2020, graduating with first-class honors. Russell and Joseph and Shanza were all trained as collaborative process lawyers. So I'm committed to assisting my clients through what's, traditionally a very difficult time by approaching matters with empathy, integrity, and compassion, and definitely promoting collaborative practice wherever it's appropriate and, would be beneficial.
Stephanie's so seasoned. She used to come to court with me pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic.
Every day we were in the courtroom, right?
Yeah, and there's just stacks of empty coffee, Tim Hortons coffee cups when you're there for, the whole day.
Does it seem like forever ago that was happening, or what?
Yeah, it's wild. It's crazy how times have changed. So with all of that housekeeping wrapped up, we will jump right into our discussion topic. So the first topic that we want to cover today is, what is the definition of a legal separation? What does it mean to be legally separated in Ontario? And Joseph, I'm going to flip it right over to you. Take it away.
Thank you. So really fascinating. There is actually a difference between legal separation and divorce. A lot of people sort of mix them up or think they're one and the same, but they're really not. So in Ontario, legal separation, it refers to an agreement, an arrangement, I should say, where a married couple decides to live apart. So this arrangement is often pursued as sort of a precursor to a divorce or even as an alternative to it. So the key aspects of legal separation is what I just mentioned was that the couple decides to live apart. So what does that mean? So this involves physically living apart from one spouse. It's also important to note, though, that living in the same residency doesn't necessarily constitute a legal separation in and of itself. You can actually be in the same house, you cannot be in the same house, but there has to be an intention to separate. That's very key. So in defining what it means to be legally separated, it's essential to understand the criteria for living separate and apart. And there's a really good case that outlines this. It comes from the courts in British Columbia. The case is Rushton and Rushton. And the court in that case outlined two conditions that must be met to establish living separate and apart. So the first being an intent to destroy the matrimonial consortium. So what does that mean? There must be a clear intention to withdraw from the matrimonial obligations with the aim of destroying the matrimonial consortium. So this means that you want to sever the relationship. The second being physical separation. So in addition to the intent outlined previously, there must also be physical separation between the parties. So this means that the spouses, the two couples, are not necessarily living separately under the same roof, but they've also physically established separate residences. So also, like I said, there can be instances where couples are still living under the same roof, but we'll get into that a little bit later in the discussion. And what's also really important to note is that there's no formal court process with respects to separation. So unlike divorce, legal separation does not require any court process. Couples can mutually agree on the terms of their separation and they can draft a separation agreement. They can do that by themselves, although we highly recommend that they don't because we often see these separation agreements getting overturned in the court. So it's really important to have a lawyer help draft those for you. As well, like I said, it's not a divorce. Separation is distinct from divorce in that the couple in and of itself still remains legally married, even though they're separated. They're free to live their separate lives. They can do what they wish, but their marital status remains unchanged. They're still married. And a big thing that people often forget is that there is no set duration for separation. Couples can remain separated indefinitely, and then they can proceed with a divorce if they wish to formally end the marriage, but there is no timeline for separation. You can be separated until you guys die. So that's sort of the big key differences.
Yeah, it's actually interesting you bring that up, Joseph. We've had clients come through the door where they've been separated. They have a separation agreement from 10 years ago, but because they're not legally divorced, they can't remarry yet, right? So you need that legal divorce in order to remarry. But, who knows how long a separation agreement will be until, yeah, you need to go to court for the divorce.
Occasionally I'll get a client who comes in and, I'll get the background, date of marriage, this and that. And finally we'll build up to the crescendo and I'll say, when did you decide to separate? It's like the day after I got married, but they've been married for 20 years.
Oh gosh.
I think there needs to be some communication, right? If you think the relationship's over, we're going to get into this, but you gotta let the other spouse know, right? You can't say, oh yeah, I decided I didn't love him 5 years ago, but nobody did anything about it. So we'll get into that as well.
Yeah, 100%. And leading into, we sort of see the difference between legally separated and divorce, but what does that mean for the rights, the responsibilities? How does it differ between being separated versus being divorced? Shanza, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, for sure. So Joseph described how they're different. So separation does not require any formal legal process. You're separated as soon as you start living separate and apart. And so this distinction kind of affects your right and obligations. Some couples may remain separated for a long time and they may not think about getting a divorce. And this is an arrangement that works for some. Legally, these couples, they remain married and they can decide to keep any legal benefits for spouses or for pension to remain in place. So the couple continues to get those benefits even though they are separated. On the other side, you will also have to accept the legal consequences of remaining married, even though you consider yourself separated. You still have the legal obligation to support each other and the children from the marriage, and you may still be responsible for any debts incurred by your ex-spouse until you enter into a separation agreement, or is the idea that you don't need it. The agreement can address all your concerns and make sure you're both free to go your own way. Another thing is if you decide to stop on separation is you're not permitted to get married to someone else if you're not getting that divorce. So these are some of the goods and bads of getting separated but not divorced. Now, divorce, on the other hand, is when you are legally terminating the marriage. You're no longer married. Naturally, you lose any spousal benefits that comes with being a spouse, and you're free to remarry. If you are opting for divorce and thinking about it, you need to start thinking about arrangements on how to deal with each parent's, if there's children, contact with children, property ownership and spousal support, everything that comes with going your separate ways. In order to obtain a divorce, you need to go through the courts and obtain a court order that will legally end your marriage. If you're common law, then all you need to do is separate. You were never married in the first place, so you don't need any court orders to end the relationship. I will focus on another distinction, and that is separation does allow couples to address issues in a less intense environment than going through the courts. At the same time, it also brings uncertainty. It can be emotionally taxing and challenging. All your negotiations can be formalized into a separation agreement, but until then, any financial and child custody arrangements, they're not legally binding. The division of property, that can also be reevaluated during the divorce, after which it becomes final. So if you are going to court and you are getting a divorce, and if it is a contested divorce, then the courts will decide these issues for you. But of course, people are also free to negotiate and resolve these matters outside of court, which is the initial aim with the separation agreement.
Exactly. And actually, you bring up a great point about common law spouses. So both married couples and common law couples can go through a legal separation process, right? You have kids that you need to deal with support, spousal support issues. But when it comes to being legally divorced, that's really only applicable for married spouses.
Mm.
Russ, did I cut you off? It looked like you wanted to jump in.
No, you're exactly right. And if you want a divorce, you're gonna have to go see a judge, right? The judge needs to sign you a divorce order. You could just separate and have your lawyers prepare the final agreement for you. So that's an important distinction as well. Lawyers can issue you a divorce order that still needs to come from the court.
If only we could, right? If only we could have that power.
One-stop shopping, just put a drive-through by the window there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we get a lot of questions because the finances are such a massive component of a lot of separations, whether it's common law spouses or married couples. So it's really important to seek independent legal advice to understand what your rights and your obligations are for those financial elements, because there's property division in the case of married couples. The benefit to married couples is that there's an automatic entitlement to equalization, so sharing in the growth of your wealth that accumulated over the course of your relationship. So to do that, to share in that property or that wealth, we look at your date of marriage, your date of separation, and how much each spouse has grown in wealth between those 2 points. We've sort of touched on it a bit last week, but for those that are just tuning in new and fresh now, that process, we look at your assets and your debts, a financial snapshot on your date of marriage, financial snapshot of your assets and debts on your date of separation. One spouse will usually have a higher growth between those 2 points than the other spouse. So what they do to sort of level the playing field is you share in the difference between your two numbers. So that's the property division component, but there's also support, and that's applicable for both married couples and common law couples. So support, unlike looking at your assets and your debts, we look at your income. So what was your income for the last 3 years? We usually exchange what's called a financial statement. And we look at your income, if there are children of the relationship, what are their ages, who are they primarily living with? And we put all of that information into a formula that provides table child support, which is the month to month, it takes care of your basic, needs for a child. There's also special expenses for kids. So we call that Section 7 expenses because that's where it's highlighted in the child support guidelines. And then there's spousal support. So spousal support is a range. So, there's so much that goes into just the financial obligations of a legal separation. And because of all of these components and nuances and exceptions, there's always exceptions to rules. So that's why we really encourage you to seek legal advice, have somebody in your corner that can tell you what you're entitled to, what you're allowed to compromise on, what you can't. Like child support, it's the right of the child. You can't waive child support. So I know I've done it. We could probably do just an hour on the financial obligations of a legal separation, but that's sort of
you could do a week.
A whole semester, a whole course. So that's just sort of a little bit of the tidbits of, how many components there are to consider when you're looking at, financially separating from one another.
One tip I would add, and I give this to lots of clients, when you legally separate, you got usually joint debts of some sort, credit card, line of credit, mortgage, property tax, car insurance, the list goes on. Even though that may have been in your spouse's name or whatever the case may be, you also still have a covenant to the bank or the credit card company to pay that bill, right? So you gotta be careful that you don't affect your credit rating, assuming your spouse is going to make all the payments and you're free and clear, and then you realize 3 payments have been missed and now your credit score is dropping. So we want to be mindful if you're on the contract and if you made a promise to the bank or to the credit card company to pay these bills, that continues until there's an agreement in a court order set, sorting all those debts out. So you want to keep that in the back of your mind if you're going through legal separation. What are my obligations to these other institutions, and how am I going to make sure that I meet those until we get an agreement in place?
And Russ, a question that we get a lot as well is what happens to the health benefits and the insurance when you separate? What's the difference between maintaining or being able to sort of remove those when you're legally separated versus divorce? Is there a difference?
First thing I do for my clients, I ask them for a copy of the agreement, because every insurance provider, unions have different benefits and private companies, and take a look at what the insurance provision says. Usually there's a definition of spouse within that. And that could be common law, it could be living together, it could be married. And that's going to be the triggering event to determine if your benefits are going to end. And lots of people will go to court and ask that their divorce be severed from the corollary relief, which is just a fancy way of saying, give me my divorce now and we'll deal with these other issues later. Well, the court will not do that if there's an issue of healthcare and benefits. So if there's a private benefit plan in place, and so let's just say hypothetically, one spouse is, requires $800-900 in medication per month or therapy or whatever his or her ailment is, the court's going to want to make sure that that expense is covered off somehow. So if you're going to sever your divorce and terminate your spouse's insurance provisions, you may have to top up their support payment by $500, $600, $700, $800 to make up for those lost healthcare benefits. So it could be really quite complicated. So the court will usually hold off until that's dealt with. There's a number of ways you can deal with that. That can be dealt with through a separation agreement that talks about private health plans and whether they're going to continue. You're going to, again, want to be mindful of the language and the policy, whether they can continue. It's possible they will end once the divorce is granted, or they'll end once they're no longer living together or no longer common law. Or sometimes a lot of clients want to put a new partner on their benefit plan, which means their old one's getting kicked out, right? They got a new boyfriend, new girlfriend, they need the dental and the healthcare. Well, that's going to be a triggering event, which could affect support obligations. So health and insurance is really important. The other thing that often gets overlooked is life insurance and other disability insurance policies that are in play. Usually when you separate, the court and your lawyers will tell you we're going to want to maintain the status quo until there's an agreement in place. So what that means is if your spouse is $1 million beneficiary on a life insurance policy, that's going to continue until that is somehow addressed. Don't run out and terminate the policy or put somebody else on it. Court's likely going to reverse that decision. They're going to want to maintain those policies in place until the court's either adjudicated or you've dealt with it in a separation agreement of some fashion. And we often will see a support obligation might be in place for 10 years. And so the life insurance might be set at a level to secure that support obligation. So the support obligation might be worth $300,000. So you would need $300,000 to secure your support obligation. The balance of your life insurance you can transfer to your kids or a new partner or whoever you want. So there's very creative ways we could go about insurance, but insurance benefits complicated. It's not something that's going to change quickly unless the proper provisions are in place. And it could have a significant financial impact on the family unit, especially if somebody's unhealthy, especially if the life insurance or disability policy is quite large. The court's going to want to make sure that it's dealt with appropriately, which means in accordance with Section 4 of the Family Law Act, which talks about sharing property, and also what Stephanie talked about, these support obligations. It could be child support, could be spousal support. You might even be required to put in place to secure your child support obligations until the kids reach a certain age as well. So lots going on, lots of moving parts. Certainly something you don't want to overlook when you're getting a legal separation. And if you're somebody receiving these benefits, it's a right that you have and that you're going to want to preserve. So you're going to want to talk to a lawyer, one of the people you see on the screen here, or go to court and ask a judge to help address those issues. Very important topic, though. Great idea, Steph, bringing that one up.
Yeah, of course. I think it's one that, like you said, it can, sorry if you hear my dog barking in the background. Yeah, it's one that definitely gets overlooked, especially when we see what we call kitchen table agreements. Yeah. So agreements that people enter into on their own. They don't really, they don't get any legal advice on their separation. A lot of those holes that we see when people come to us later on, health benefits and insurance is a big one that a lot of people accidentally miss because they just didn't know about it.
Or the kitchen table agreement was a document they've downloaded from Oregon, right? And it doesn't refer to Ontario legislation or the rules in Ontario. So it's a nice document, but it's not going to help you if you have to go to court.
Exactly. And then it's sort of creating more problems down the line than, you know, if you sort of dealt with it accordingly at the time.
Yeah.
So
because the problem is that somebody's going to have to set it aside and fix it, which is going to be lawyers and judges. It's going to be a year of legal fees. So we'll just do it right the first time.
Yeah, 100%. So we sort of touched on finances. Now, another, major component that we see is what happens with the children, like the impact on the children when you legally separate or legally divorce, and how do the courts or how do you, through your lawyers, deal with parenting arrangements and support? Joe, I'll flip it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. So you sort of nailed it on the head. When parties do separate, more often than not, they are separating and living apart in separate households. So there's a real focus on the well-being of the children, and that's paramount, regardless whether like whatever step you are in the process, whether that be separation or even post-divorce. Um, and you know, it's really important. There's so many different factors that need to be taken into consideration. There's the parenting arrangements, there's the child support obligations, and even the parental responsibilities. So beginning first, at least with, you know, the parenting arrangements, with respects to legal separation, parents can negotiate those parenting arrangements, excuse me, through a separation agreement, or even by way of communication between the parties' counsel if they've decided to retain counsel. And this parenting arrangement, through the separation agreement, outlines decision-making responsibility, which was known previously as custody. They changed the wording in 2020, as well as the parenting time of the children. Parenting time was formerly known as access. They changed that in 2020 as well. And regardless of who decides to have certain decision-making responsibility powers and how the parenting time is allocated, that can be flexible and tailored to the family's needs. That's stuff that can be worked out. And oftentimes there's different arrangements. And that's sort of best suited for lawyers to come into play, and they can work with the parties to establish that. With respects to divorce, and going to court and getting this separation agreement sort of implemented as a court order, these parenting arrangements are formalized in a court-approved parenting plan or order. And courts always encourage parents to reach these agreements outside of court, because as Russ mentioned last week, if you tuned in, no one wants a third party making any decisions with respect to your family, someone who's on the outside and doesn't know the family dynamics of your family relationships. So it's always really important that if you do go to court, just know that a judge will have to decide based on the best interests of the children. Moving on to child support. So parents can determine child support payments through a separation agreement or by communication between counsel, and then that would be implemented into a separation agreement. However, it's really important to note that any such agreement between the parties must comply with the child support guidelines, and those are set by the federal government and they are federal law. Child support is mandatory and no one can opt out of paying it. It's mandatory, it has to be done. The child support payments are the right of the child, not the rights of the parents. And same thing with divorce. These child support obligations are typically established during the divorce proceedings. And like in a separation agreement, support payments for the children are determined based on the child support guidelines, unless special circumstances warrant any such deviation, but we'll speak to that later as well. Not in today's topics, but definitely down the line, we'll speak to specific child support obligations and how the payments get determined. As well with parental responsibilities. So even though parents are most often living apart, they both still retain their parental responsibilities and rights. And these rights and responsibilities are expected to continue. And the parents are supposed to be continuing fulfilling their duties as parents, including making decisions in the children's best interests. Whether parties are divorced or not, that does not change parental responsibilities. Both parents are still responsible for the care and upbringing of their children, regardless of their marital status. So it doesn't matter if you're separated or divorced, you have these obligations.
Thanks, Joe. And it's interesting, actually. It's how you mentioned child support and terms relating to the children in the divorce, because we've seen in the past, you know, courts will not grant your divorce if you haven't taken into consideration the, you know, what's going to happen with the children, what are the support payments for the children, the arrangements for the children. So it is really, really important to consider those while you're going through both your legal separation and eventually if you want to pursue a divorce through your divorce.
No, for sure, for sure.
And support is going to be geared towards income too, right?
Yeah.
So the person making 500,000 has a different obligation than the person making 30,000. And there's tables and charts to figure all that out, and online tools as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I know I'm piggybacking like the financial obligations with property and spousal support. This could be an entire course just on child support. And how
This,
do you divide the special expenses? Do you do it proportionate to your income? And what happens if the parents are, or sorry, the children are living with one parent versus if the children are, shared. Shared isn't 50-50, it's actually 60-40, right? There are so many different components that impact child support. So it's, again, important to speak to a lawyer, important to know your rights.
we're just providing a taste. Like when we're designing this program, we thought, okay, what if we had a friend or an uncle or a brother who didn't go to law school? How would we explain some of these concepts to them? And that's what we're trying to do here today. We're just hitting the tip of the iceberg, like Daphne's saying. There's so much more that you want to consider, but we want to give you a basic understanding of some of these concepts. So I think everybody's doing a fantastic job.
Yeah, and actually before we move on, we actually got a question in the Q&A box about child support, and is it possible to do a lump sum child support? Russ, do you
Wow.
want to take this one?
I had families who've asked me to calculate that. The risk is there's benefits and drawbacks, right? Child support is the right of the child, and you can't contract out of that. So let's just say the child is 8 years old. We got 10 more years of guideline support, maybe more if they go on the post-secondary education or other training. So that you have 8 years of support. So how do we calculate that? We'd have to really consider what the payer's income is, and what the history of that income is. So if we're looking at a salaried employee, maybe a government worker who's hit the top of their tier in terms of public service pay, and we can predict with some accuracy what the increases will be, we can get a fairly good ballpark. Okay, this person's going to make 150,000 indexed to inflation for the next 10 years, have an actuary, they'll do the calculation. We'll get the number fairly close to what it should be and maybe top it up or have a provision indicating that if it's short at the end of the 10-year period, the payer agrees to top it up. So some kind of review mechanism. Much more difficult when you have a self-employed entrepreneur or somebody can control their income. So if they're using capital losses to reduce their taxable income to Revenue Canada, we had a case, our client, this particular client was making $30 million, was using capital losses on investments to bring his income down to about 1.5, but he's still bringing in $30 million, but setting it off. So the question is, I don't think the court would allow that capital loss when it comes to calculating child support. So now we're looking at a huge goalpost in terms of ranges of support. We could have a lump sum payment of 1.5 million, potentially, for child support, or we could have a lump sum payment approaching 15, 20 million, depending on how we dealt with that capital gain issue. This isn't the right of the parent, this is the right of the child to get it right. So short answer is it's fact driven, depending on the circumstances and your ability to predict payer's income. There's another factor. I think we spent an hour on this question. The other question is, what if the child flips over to the payer's residency and the support obligations end and you've prepaid that support? Are you going to want to get that back? Say there's a parenting issue and parenting time, or what we used to call custody switches over the other parent. Mobility issues, a whole bunch of issues that come into play. I would avoid it, but it can be done. And you're going to want to make sure you do your due diligence and be very careful about the payer's income. Great question, though.
Yeah, I would just jump right onto that as well and say, in my experience, I would caution it. As for all the factors that Russ said, your income might fluctuate. You don't, what happens if, knock on wood, something happens and you no longer can work and you paid a lump sum support. Yeah. There's so many factors. We see more and more lump sum support when it comes to spousal, because that's something that parents can contract in or out of. Whereas, like Russ, Joseph said, child support is the right of the child. So it's definitely tread with caution for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna.
And the flip side of that is there's some certainty for the recipient, right? They've got their support prepaid, they can budget on it, they know what they have to get through the next 10 years. And they can invest it, which can generate income as well. So there's, you know, a lot of good that can come from it as well, depending on how the calculation's done.
For sure. So just to switch gears a little bit from finances and focusing on living arrangements, Shanza, could you share, you know, some considerations that parents of separating, parents that are separating that they should consider when considering whether they should still live together versus living apart? How's that going to impact parenting?
Yeah, sure. I can speak on this. So this decision, it depends on various factors, particularly the dynamic of the relationship between the parties. Are they amicable? Is there conflict? Can they live in the same house without tearing each other apart? What is the reason for the separation? Really, it boils down to the type of relationship between the two. A lot of couples continue to live in the same house when they're separate. And there can be multiple reasons why they would prefer such an arrangement. Like you said, children, it allows the parents to co-parent and provide more stability to the kids. That's what the kids are used to, and that's what they keep getting even when the parties have separated. Finances is another reason. Saving money is a big one. If you continue to live together, you can continue the status quo. That is how things were running while the parties were married. So if you are sharing expenses, you continue to do that, continue with those shared mortgage payments or rent, groceries, and all those arrangements continue on how they were before. There can be other reasons, could be convenience, shared responsibilities, any cultural, religious reasons. Many factors come into play here. If you do decide to live together, here's I think some considerations that are good to take into account. Are you able to maintain healthy boundaries? Have clear ground rules on what's okay, what's not okay. You can have ground rules relating to new partners, having guests over, or even just splitting general household responsibilities. For finances, it is a good idea to maybe begin to divide expenses of the home in a more clearer way. Maybe how will the mortgage go out now that you have separated, bills, groceries. Maybe talk to your partner about separating any joint accounts that were previously being used to maybe to assist with the transition where you're both trying to go your separate ways. Splitting parenting responsibilities is a good idea if there are children. Sort of having a parenting plan that factors in the new dynamics of your relationship, especially so that it doesn't affect the well-being of the children. On the flip side, there are couples where living together may not work out. For example, if there is domestic violence or if there's just too much conflict, in that case, it may be best for the parties to separate the living quarters. If you are living separately, that means you need to adjust financial arrangements, again, accordingly, budgeting for 2 households instead of 1. That could involve, if you're living in 2 different houses, that could involve financial support obligations. I know Joe talked about child support just now. Realizing how to use the joint account, using separate accounts, number of things that needs to be worked on, having a more defined parenting plan if there's children, because now you're going to be splitting time from one household to another. All in all, I would say communication and boundary setting are crucial for making any situation work, whether you are living together or not. I would also add that it's important to consider the emotional impact of living separately but in the same house. seeking mental health support should always be on the table. At the end of the day, which arrangement works or doesn't work, I would say just depend on the unique situation of the couple and their ability to communicate and to respect each other.
For sure. There's just one thing I want to add to that. So Shanza definitely pointed out that parties can still live together while being legally separated. However, it's really important to know that if you are still living together, if you do want to end up having a divorce later on, you still have to meet that requirement of living separate and apart, so to speak, for a minimum of a year. So you have to be very careful to make sure that you are ensuring that if you are still living under the same roof, that there are certain factors that can sort of distinguish whether or not the parties are still living separate and apart under the same roof. There's one really good case that comes out of the courts in New Brunswick. The case is called Dupery and Dupery, and they actually list several factors. We spoke about it a bit last week, but they list several factors that showcase the difference between a couple that is truly living separate apart, as opposed to a couple who maybe is merely experiencing some discomfort in the relationship while still residing in the same home. So they pointed out the fact that there are separate bedrooms. So the spouses should have separate sleeping arrangements, which is also indicating a clear division of personal space between one another. With respects to sex, a lack of sexual relations between the spouses can indicate a breakdown in the marital relationship, which is extremely important, going back to what Steph said in terms of determining that date of separation. In terms of communication, so limited or no communication between the spouses suggests a lack of emotional connection, typically of separated couples. Services for each other, so that can be an absence of shared responsibilities, such as shopping for groceries, cooking, or laundry. Eating meals separately, as well as no having any social activities together. So those factors in and of itself can help the courts determine if the parties are still living separate and apart under the same roof. And while parties may want to reconcile their relationship, that's great, but you have to be mindful of those factors as well if you want to seek a divorce later on.
And they are just that, they're factors, right? The courts will consider, perhaps if you're living separate and apart under the same roof, but you have young kids, maybe you're going to make dinner for the entire family and eat together, but the romantic relationship between the spouses isn't there. They don't go on dates. They don't present like a couple anymore. Maybe they've told their friends, they've changed their Facebook status, they've had conversations amongst themselves that says, we're separated, but for the benefit of the kids, we're going to continue to co-parent until we finalize our legal separation.
You got this trend of sleep divorce now too, right?
Yeah.
People sleeping in different rooms. Maybe they got apnea or health issues and they're still together, just separate bedrooms. Sort of like king and queen on, The Crown. Anyway, and the other tip I would add, and maybe we can include this for show notes for our audience, is the rules of separated parents. We have this schedule of basically common sense rules. Unfortunately, we have to write it out for our clients sometimes, just basically on how they should be interacting with each other, especially when there's children involved. Communicating politely, not involving the kids, not using the kids as spies or weapons. So we'll include that as a show note as well in tomorrow's survey.
Yeah. And actually, I'm just going to jump around here a bit because Joseph, you sort of mentioned it already, this concept of reconciliation and what does that do? If the party's separated, but after a few months, maybe they want to try again, they want to work on the relationship. What are, the timelines? How does that impact their separation and eventually their divorce?
Yeah, for sure. So the idea of legal separation provides couples with sort of this structured framework to live apart while still addressing important legal and financial matters, as Shanza mentioned earlier. And the Divorce Act, which is federal legislation, encourages spouses actually to reconcile and, in fact, gives spouses the right to cohabitate for a single period of time or several periods of time. However, that time can total no more than 90 days. And that's after the separation begins for the purposes of reconciliation without interrupting the period during which they lived separate and apart. So basically, long story short is,
Set your countdown clock, right?
yeah, exactly. So
So
you
got
have
a countdown clock for your vacation or Christmas.
89.
This is when I've become reconciled, right?
Exactly. So really, it is a countdown clock. So these separated spouses are allowed sort of, they call it a trial period of 90 days to reconcile with, and that, that doesn't cut short the required 1 year separation time. So during that time, couples may have the opportunity to reflect on the relationship. They can seek counseling or marriage therapy, and they can work together to really address those underlying issues. They have those 90 days to do so. But it's really important that you stay under that 90-day mark, because as soon as you go over, that 1 year clock starts again and you're back to zero.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would just add to that, there's different stages of the separation.
Oh, yeah.
Somebody may have been thinking about it for months, years. And the other spouse, it's a shock, right? They didn't see it coming. So, you got denial, anger, somebody may be at a different stage and want to reconcile and work on the relationship. The other spouse is checked out, may give it a try, but it isn't genuine. So you want to be mindful as well in terms of what stage of the separation process you're at and what stage your spouse is at. And sometimes it makes it difficult to resolve some of these issues until, the spouses have kind of caught up to the fact that, yeah, this relationship's over and I can't fix it.
For sure. And I just want to mention real quick, and the real difference in terms of reconciliation between separation and divorce is that divorce is final. Divorce results in the termination of the marriage, as Shanza mentioned. So once that divorce is finalized, the marital relationship is legally dissolved, and that just means both parties are free to remarry. So once you get through that divorce, there really is no reconciliation at that point. And if the parties do decide to reconcile, they would have to remarry. That's the only way. You can't go back to your original marriage. You're gonna have to go through the marriage license process again and remarry.
That happens. I had a couple, they divorced, got remarried, got divorced again, which made the second one really easy because we had nice, clean date of marriage equalization of all the assets, right? So, but yeah, who knows what's going to happen? Everybody acts differently. So
100%. And, when we're looking at the reconciliation process, like Joseph said, that 90 days, that cooling off period, it can be really important because if you try again, you re-engage in your relationship and it's day 91 or day 92, and then you're like, no, it's not working anymore. And you sort of passed that point. So that 91st or 92nd day, when you separate, that may become your new, or that will become your new date of separation. So that can impact, everything that we discussed when it comes to financial obligations, splitting assets, because now you're not using a date of separation from 3 months ago, you're using today.
right.
So that can be really significant as well.
And in those 90 days, did one person get this huge debt that's tying the other person? There's a lot of factors that need to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, assets can change value pretty quickly, especially with the market. Yeah,
for sure.
And that's really important, and it sort of ties into what I'm about to ask Shanza here is, why is it important to have a separation agreement? Why is it necessary? Can you just say, oh, we're separated, go our separate ways, and just kind of leave it at that? We keep talking about all these different factors, but Shanza, I'm gonna flip it over to you.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna just say like the importance of separation agreements, it really comes from what it does, right? The agreement addresses what your life will look like post-separation. The purpose is to provide closest thing to certainty and closure by entering into this agreement, this piece of paper that is going to address some very important aspects of your life, and how everything will be arranged moving forward where you're both no longer together. If you don't enter into a separation agreement, what does that mean? It means you're leaving potential issues unaddressed out in the open, and you don't know how and when certain events can occur, and how you and your spouse will decide on them when they do occur. Many issues can linger on and escalate and bite you later on. Like you don't know. You can't anticipate all of that, right? Problems. So for example, like problems can arise when life changes happen. Like if you have kids that are going to college, or let's say someone loses their job, who pays for college and how much each person contributes? This is something that might not have been discussed if at the time you were separating, the kids were little. And in the future, disagreements can happen. There's no way of knowing whether 10 years down the line you're going to agree on college, on education expenses. So without an agreement, there's this uncertainty, there's potential for future conflicts. You're leaving a lot of gray areas for yourself. Another significant concern is retroactive support claims. A request for support, sorry, I'll explain what retroactive support is. Like, it is a request for support dating back to date of separation, for example. When you separate and you don't enter into a separation agreement and you don't address support obligations, that doesn't mean you can just ignore them. Just because you didn't pay it when it was due doesn't mean you don't have to anymore, or you won't be made to pay it. Dating back to when it first became due. Sorry, after hours. Some people will remain separated for months or even years. So it's really essential that you do protect yourself and have all the issues settled and agreed to in writing. To move forward, you need to know who gets which assets, who is responsible for that, how much support, how long. You want to have everything fixed, and you want to be able to know moving forward what will be expected of you. I'll also add that if you do decide to divorce, the separation can easily become a part of the divorce and become your divorce settlement agreement. That means that the arrangements that were made during the separation, they can be formalized and they can become binding as part of the divorce settlement. This streamlines the divorce proceedings. It will just be building upon the groundwork laid during the separation period. And I'll just say that whether you enter into a separation agreement or not, the limitation period will continue to run. So if the parties choose not to enter into an agreement, claims related to division of property may expire. And there's not a lot you can do if you do miss that period. So there's definitely that thing. That is something that parties should be mindful of when they are deciding on, whether to enter into that separation agreement or not.
Yeah, you avoid the he said, she said scenario, right? You get some clarity, you get some certainty, you know what the terms are. You could avoid future disputes if the agreement is drafted properly. You can file the agreement with the Family Responsibility Office for enforcement if support's not being paid. And also, a well-structured agreement will have a dispute resolution clause or something to deal with material changes. So if you do need to change the agreement, or if there is a change that requires an update, the language will be in the agreement so you can understand, okay, these are the steps that I follow to update the agreement. So really, really great tips, Shanza. Thank you.
Yeah, and I tell clients all the time, like, this is going to be your guidebook, your Bible, your roadmap for moving forward, especially if there's kids involved and the kids are young. Like, this is going to provide you with a roadmap. So in 5 years, if, like Russ said, something happens, a material change occurs, you don't have to run back to lawyers to sort out what happens. The separation agreement, if drafted well, will outline the next steps that you take. So you can work on things together, or you could use a mediator or somebody else to overcome those hurdles that might arise in the future. So a massive question, we sort of touched on it last week, but a huge question we always get is, how long is this going to take? What's the time frame? What's the, like, how long will a separation agreement take? How long
It
will it take to
depends,
get
right? It
divorced?
depends.
100%. It always
Yeah.
depends. I know Joseph mentioned the 1 year mark. So when it comes to a divorce, the timeline for obtaining a divorce is 1 year. So from your date of separation, 1 year to that day, you can apply for a divorce. I mean, obviously, considering if there's, issues for child support or pertaining to parenting time, those will need to be addressed before a divorce could be granted. But when it comes to drafting and finalizing a separation agreement, it truly depends on, how cooperative are both parties, how amicable are you, how many issues are there, what is there to consider. More often than not, as long as it's appropriate between the parties, we try to encourage settlement. Russ has said it, Joe said it, Shanza said it. You don't really want, or a judge or a third party to make those decisions for your family, but sometimes it's required. If two spouses are just too far apart and they cannot come to an agreement, then sometimes it's important to have that third party's voice to either facilitate settlement or to just make a decision. So how long is it going to take? It really depends.
And
But
I know, sorry, I was gonna say, I know people often think, oh, like we waited the 1 year, like we can get the divorce right away. Like, no, that's just the legislative requirement for parties to be separated before they can seek a divorce. Russ mentioned it last week because we were speaking on it. The court can take 9, 12, even 16 months to issue that divorce, depends how backed up they are. So it's not a process that just, happens, snap of your fingers. It can, it can take 2 years all in all.
100%.
Just
And,
a quick story on that. Sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
I had a friend who wanted me to get his divorce, right? And I had handled the separation. And he said, yeah, I need this. I need this. I go, what are you talking about? I got to file the documents. We're going to wait for the court to issue it. Then there's a waiting period. So what had happened was his new girlfriend had put an ad in the paper announcing their new wedding date. To kind of give it to his old wife. You got to be kidding me. Like, I cannot get you a divorce in 2 weeks. Like, it's just, people just don't understand, there's this juggernaut called the justice system that we have to work with. And there's people ahead of you in line. You got to wait your turn. But sorry, Steph.
no, it's super fair. Like you said, people think, oh, that's it, let's file. But like Joe said, I've had one that took 7 months, 8 months, and that was just a simple divorce, right?
Yeah.
That's not considering, if there are unresolved issues or if it becomes contested, the other person comes back and has, wants to bring forth support claims or claims that the other person didn't consider or, include in the materials. So, and, another question that sort of ties into how long is this going to take is how long is this going to cost? So, Russ, do you want to sort of touch on, the legal process and the cost that can come with legal separation and divorce?
Cost is going to be directly affected by a number of factors. How complicated the matter is, multiple assets, multiple children's dispute over parenting time, and the mindset of your spouse and what kind of lawyer he or she chooses. We talked a little bit about this last week. Some people feel wronged or somebody cheated and they want retribution, or they're determined to prove their spouse is a narcissist for whatever reason. And they hire a lawyer who's going to slash and burn everything to the ground. That's a difficult piece of litigation, right? There's some litigants that will stop at nothing. And so those cases we manage as best as we can with the assistance of a judge. Can get quite expensive, but there's not much we can do to control the expense and the conduct of the other party, except ordering cost order and maybe having him or her characterized as a vexatious litigant. And some go very quickly. You know, the couple have not a kitchen table agreement, but they've agreed on in point form what things are going to look like. Here's our parenting schedule. Here's how we want to share our property. This is what we're looking at for support. And we execute on that. We give them the advice, and all the friction's gone. So the lawyers can move fairly quickly to deliver an agreement and get the matter settled. So those are sort of the bookends of what we're seeing. 6 points I want to make in no particular order. Get legal representation. You're welcome to contact somebody on this panel or anybody you want. Know what your rights and obligations are. You got a flavor and a taste today. These are complicated, deeply complex matters that are fact-driven. So you want to understand how the facts apply to your particular family and get a proper legal opinion. Court fees and expenses. You want to get a handle on what that's going to be. We talked a little bit about it today. We talked about it last week. There's filing fees associated with each step. You want to create a bit of a budget, get an understanding of what you're getting into. We've talked about complexity and duration. Those are those bookends we just mentioned. Look at alternative dispute resolution options, mediation, ADR, collaborative practice. These are, the court's going to expect you to try to resolve as much as you can before you go to a court. I've had judges tell me, especially where the agreement says you're going to mediate any disputes. People rush off to court. First thing they do is read the agreement. Said, did you try to mediate? The party says no. They kick them out of the courtroom. Say, go mediate and come back in 6 months. I'm not going to hear you. So explore settlement before you ask a judge for relief. The theme of tonight's presentation is avoid kitchen table agreements. Sure, you can come to an agreement, but have a lawyer prepare it properly. And the reason why we say that is if it needs to be fixed, you can spend a lot more money having a lawyer set it aside and having a judge make a new court order than if you'd just done it properly at the front end. You'd be into it for several $1,000s to set aside an agreement. It's also in your interest to have it done properly so your other spouse can't come back later and complain. So the big things lawyers look at when considering whether the agreement's valid, and the court's going to consider the same. We want to look at duress. This is a marriage contract that was signed on the evening of the wedding with everybody showing up, and the party didn't have a chance to review or consider. It's really pressured into it. Closer to the wedding date, the more likely this agreement is going to be set aside. Independent legal advice. Did the person have an opportunity to understand what they were signing? Did the lawyer properly explain the agreement and process to them? And disclosure. When we say disclosure, what we're saying is you need to put all your cards on the table. So if you have a separation agreement and you're hiding, your crypto account with 100 grand in it, and you didn't disclose that was an asset of the marriage, and it's later discovered that you had that asset, the agreement can be set aside because there wasn't proper disclosure. That's just one example of many incidences where there's not proper disclosure. It could be the home wasn't properly valued, the pension wasn't properly valued. A whole slew of things could be inadequate in disclosure. This is why you want a lawyer to help you through that process. The disclosure is important because then you can make an informed decision as to what your rights and obligations. You can make a bad deal, but you just need to know what that bad deal is. And you need to know what the compromises are. But if you don't know you're making a bad deal and somebody misled you or committed a misleading financial statement, then that's a basis to set it aside again. So to answer your question, Steph, it depends.
Always
on
depends.
A number of factors. But we encourage everyone to try to be reasonable and explore settlement before we take anybody to court.
Thanks, Russ. And I think that, puts a nice bow on today's discussion. There's lots to consider. There's so many aspects of a legal separation and a divorce that if you don't do this every day, you might not think of. And that's why seeking legal advice is beneficial now and in the long run. But I want to thank everyone for joining. I'm absolutely enjoying this series. Next week, we're going to be talking about navigating parenting and visitation rights. So tune in if that's something that you want to know more about. And we will see you next week. Hopefully, today was helpful for all our viewers.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Shanza, Joseph, Stephanie, fantastic as always, and have a great night.
Bye,
Good night,
everyone.
everyone.